Coming up, Lord knows the season doesn't matter for the New York Football Giants, but what if they tear it down to the studs? Our first look at GM and head coach tandem. Could Mike Vrabel, defensive mind, be the selection? We dive in coming up next. Yes, my friends. It's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your host. Over here, Adam Marmot. Over there, Andrew Mackwitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise, and we're talking beyond the season for the New York Football Giants, because there are going to be, Andy, if the Giants choose to blow things up and start from scratch again, no shortage of potential hires for head coach, hires for GMs, and the tandems that we want to create to have success going forward. How are we on a Wednesday, sir?
I'm doing good, and I just thought about this, Adam. This is something that we talked about off podcast, but how foolish are we going to look if the Giants just turn around after this tire fire and they say, you know what, we're good with Joe Shane and Brian Dable. It seems like let's just run this 2-15 season back, chef's kiss. All of this deep diving, deep analytics that we ended up putting together will be all for naught. But at least we could probably turn around and say, "I told you so," right?
Or maybe, talk about hedging halfway through next season when the Giants are 1-5 and the Shane Dable ticket looks disastrous. We'll say, well, you can go ahead and check back. And by the way, half those coaches are in head coaching roles now. Some of those assistant GMs are now GMs for other organizations. And we actually have a whole nother episode to do here about at the time of the hire of Joe Shane and Brian Dable. What were the other options? What did some of us talk about? And how have those organizations gone on to probably, in almost every single case, have more success? But today we stay focused on Andy's first. This is not his number one option, just his first sample of what could be the case. And you chose, in all of your wisdom, to go head coach hire first and worry about the GM second. Break down your Mike Vrabel candidacy.
Well, Adam, this all came to be because, as we know, the reports came out yesterday that Bill Belichick is expected to be the next head coach of the University of North Carolina, just like we all expected. Like, he leaves the Patriots. He may be the greatest football coach of all time. He decides, let me go back to college, which I've never coached in before, and in the NIL era, do this. I mean, before we get to Vrabel, can you just say, like, how bizarre is this whole situation?
Well, here's the one thing. I mean, total bizarre that he's going to college to coach, like nothing that anyone would anticipate. What I will say is we maybe all should have collectively looked at it and said, if not a head coach job, because a lot of times people were saying, what about a GM position? You know, would he come into an organization? Maybe the Giants would say, hey, not head coach, but come in and get us back on track as an organization. Because Bill Belichick views himself as a head coach first, we probably should have assumed that it's coaching role in any capacity first before any other type of situation. The fact that it's UNC, though, is certainly a left field, even by college standards. You would have thought there would have been a dozen other, at minimum, schools that you would have said historically, right? Geographically, I don't know. Every single element of it would have pointed somewhere else. But old Billy Boy is never one to lack for surprise.
Yeah, it was shocking to me. His 250-page manifesto of like what needs to happen for him to be the coach is also bizarre. Like, he wants his son to be the coach in waiting, so maybe this is more about his son getting another opportunity than it is.
By the way,
Bill's.
UNC, not a problem. Not going to be a problem.
Hey,
not a problem.
I got 3 years here, and then I hand the keys to my son, and I've set it up perfectly for him. But the reason why it made me immediately think of Mike Vrabel is obviously Mike Vrabel was a great player under Bill Belichick in all of the Super Bowl years. And, Mike Vrabel started at Ohio State and then moved over to be the Houston Texans linebacker coach. And he rose to the ranks very quickly as a very sharp guy, leader of men, moved to the defensive coordinator position for the Texans, and then gets hired for the Tennessee Titans in 2018. And, Adam, a funny thing happens where he gets hired and they just continue to build on the success they have. He takes Ryan Tannehill and he makes them an 11-5 team, winning the division. He makes them the following year a 12-5 team, getting the number 1 seed in the AFC. And then the next year he starts out 7-3 before the carpet kind of gets pulled out from underneath him. They lose 7 straight, and it's an unmitigated disaster. But those are the types of things that happen to allow someone like Mike Vrabel to be a free agent coach at the moment to begin with. The reason why I like Mike Vrabel is because when I think of the New York Giants, I also think stout defense, hard-nosed, like emotionally invested in the success of the team. To me, Mike Vrabel is that type of person. I don't necessarily know like how his X's and O's are on offense. Obviously, he cut his chops in the NFL on defense and a little bit on special teams, even though he caught touchdown passes as a tight end every now and then. But for me, I look at it and say, give me a head coach. Everyone's going offensive, young-minded. Give me a defensive coach, and let's reset the identity of the New York Giants to be a defensive-first team that says, no matter what, we're not going to be the 32nd rushing against team in the NFL. That should not happen under Mike Vrabel.
Yeah, so on a historical standpoint, it makes sense for the Giants, right? They've been known as a defensive team. They've been known as a hard hitting, right? So I think that Mike Vrabel, like in some ways, I can get some Tom Coughlin kind of energy off of Mike Vrabel, offensive coach versus defensive, but just that sense of like, we're going to do it the way that we do it. There's going to be an expectation. Now, some people say that that's just not the way that the NFL or like sports work anymore. You can't be that type of coach, but he did have a track record with the Titans of building and having success. I'm not against this as a candidate. I think there's a lot of reasons why it makes sense. One immediate question that I would go to is, okay, so who's the offensive coordinator? Because that's always the problem you come back to. And it doesn't mean that defensive minded coaches can't be successful head coaches. That's never the case. We've actually seen some indications that it was an overreaction to demand offensive minds at the highest position. But as would be the case in tearing down to the studs in any scenario, you do have to then look at, if we're drafting a quarterback in next year's draft class, if we also have real concerns on the offensive side of the football, who's going to be helming that ship? So I might sit here and say, Vrabel, okay, now tell me the coaching staff, and maybe you have the easy answer when it comes to who runs that side of the football.
Well, I want to leave it open for right now.
That's
on
fine.
the offensive side of the ball. On the defensive side of the ball, obviously Mike Vrabel is a defensive-minded coach. He can handle it. There's a couple of names that come to mind. One that I think about, and maybe you're like, okay, a hat on a hat, but is Jim Schwartz, the defensive coordinator for the Cleveland Browns. He has worked in Tennessee quite a bit. He was a special defensive assistant under Mike Vrabel in Tennessee. They have connections. The Cleveland Browns are a tire fire. You could very easily see Jim Schwartz being like, I'm ready to move on. A tandem of Jim Schwartz and Mike Vrabel as your defensive coaches, to me, I'd look at it and say, that side of the house is doing pretty good, and I wouldn't have concerns about them just being a shell of a defense like the Giants have looked this year.
And there's a strong case to be made from that standpoint. One, that like when you mention the name like Schwartz, I think you always go, wouldn't want him as a head coach, but like him as a coordinator, right? Like there's guys that are like that, and it's not a knock on them. So, if you said, what about Jim Schwartz hat in the ring for head coach? Well, let's all just calm down here. But the other part of that, I think, from hiring a defensive head coach and thinking about how staff might build out is, we believe that there's an immense amount of talent on the defensive side of the ball. We believe that with some cap space, one offseason, one free agency class, one more draft class, add some secondary help, and all of a sudden the talent is all there, right? You have Dexter Lawrence. You still have Kayvon Thibodeau, at least in the short term. You just went and got a player like Brian Burns. Bobby Okereke is still there, right? So when you look at the roster and you say, hiring Mike Vrabel means we become what we think on paper we should be, one of the better defenses and one of those teams that grinds them into the ground. I think many would say we score 14.9 points per game. There's a much larger issue on this team, and it is the offensive side of the football, but it's a conversation worth having. Now, who's the GM in all of this? Because again, Andy's telling me John Mara hired Mike Vrabel, and now we don't know who the GM is. Coming back here in a second, two interesting candidates to talk about, and we'll see whether or not this meets the test of top 5 tandems that the Giants should look at if breaking things down to the studs. We'll do that here in just one moment. Oh, my friends, as we continue today's One Giant podcast, we remind you it's brought to you by Pietential, Pietential.com. Over on Pietential, you're going to go ahead and get plenty of opportunities on their platform to improve yourself from a health and well-being standpoint. They set a baseline for your well-being. They give you tools to improve over time and also help you track your progress. It's a great way, if you are Brian Dable or Joe Shane, maybe look into Pietential following being dismissed. I want you guys to be healthy, want you to be well. Check out Pietential today. Okay. Mike Vrabel is the guy that we like in this situation. We believe, let's bring back that identity to the New York Football Giants. GM ties to Mike Vrabel that you believe could be viable.
So Adam, With that question, let's start with the very, very easy answer for me, and that is former general manager John Robinson of the Tennessee Titans.
Okay.
And Adam, you may say the Tennessee Titans, like, Andy, are we just trying to be the Titans North? Well, I mean, it could be a lot worse than being the Tennessee Titans under John Robinson, who were consistently above 500 in the playoffs, winning divisions, getting the number 1 seed. I don't know. That sounds pretty good to me. And when you think about, like, well, did he inherit a really good team and did he just put gasoline on the fire? Well, when he took over the Tennessee Titans, their previous record was 3-13 in 2015. He then immediately turned around and went 9-7 3 consecutive years. It wasn't good enough under Marcus Mariota, so he decided to make a change. He got rid of Mike Mularkey. He ended up saying Marcus Mariota is not the guy for me. And you know what he does? He hires Mike Vrabel and he goes and gets Ryan Tannehill, who everyone said was not very good for the Miami Dolphins. They were very quick to get him out of there. And the funny thing happens when all of a sudden the Tennessee Titans go 11-5 and they win their division. They then go 12-5, win their division, and have the number 1 seed in all of the AFC. They had won playoff games throughout this whole ordeal. And then the following season, it comes out that they start 7-3. They come out scorching hot. And then the wheels fall off and they end up going 0-7 in their last 7 games. And because of that, John Robinson is let go. They clean house and they decide to move on. But Adam, couldn't the Giants do a lot worse than a guy that took over a 3-13 record and immediately made them playoff viable the next season?
Yeah, yes, I think so. And like so tie it into the tandem of GM and head coach, right? And when you mention bringing a player like Tannehill and still being a successful team inside of an AFC South, that if you go back and look over it, you might say there's some easy wins on the schedule relative to the competitive level of that division over the last handful of years. That's all fine. You play who you play. But to tie it back to the Giants in the way that, is Daniel Jones what's holding back Brian Dable and this offense, Joe Shane and all the issues? Well, no one is sitting here talking about Ryan Tannehill being even on the level of, say, a Kirk Cousins when you talk about a little bit of a guy that's not top tier quarterback, but certainly functional, certainly useful, can certainly win games for you. Tannehill was a step below that. And you still navigated yourself to winning football seasons, still navigated yourself to playoff appearances. And I think even if you're going to draft a quarterback next year or in the next 2 seasons, we assume safely, to think that you're going to have a bridge quarterback in here at some point, and once you know that you have your heir apparent in place, you want to be able to go out and start to show you can win football games. You're constructing like I'm going to say a very safe, but very comforting version of what the Giants could do. We've been such a mess. Let's not get all jacked up, overexcited about offensive QB whisperers and the young hot commodity at assistant GM. Just give me stability that 5 years from now, I'll look back and say, over the last 5 seasons, the Giants had winning records 4 out of 5 years. The Giants made the playoffs a couple of times. The Giants were competitive in the division year over year, right? Like, I think that's, if I can take the high level view, that's what this scenario is for Andy. This is, hey man, let's just not be a joke anymore. And let's start to reset our baseline and then think about the big, bold moves that you make from there.
100%. Adam, keep in mind the 2 Giants Super Bowl wins were when the Giants were wild cards, not necessarily winning the division.
Get us in the door.
They literally,
games, right?
Yeah, get in the show, have a stout defense that can get pressure on the quarterback, and obviously have a Hall of Fame caliber quarterback in Eli Manning to help you along the way. Obviously, that was kind of the piece that was missing for the Tennessee Titans. Felt like their defense was pretty stout. The offense was decent with Derrick Henry and a good run game, but they just didn't have enough to get over the top of teams like the Kansas City Chiefs and the New England Patriots in Tom Brady's heyday. And so, Adam, I kind of sit here and I say that connection to me seems pretty stable. It would allow you a lot of flexibility on the offensive side of the ball to be able to shape whatever you want. My simple answer is I'll go back to that very quickly for you because I know that you had asked me like, well, who's the offensive coordinator then? I'll pose a question to you. Do you think the Chicago Bears regret not hiring Cliff Kingsbury as their offensive coordinator?
Yeah, obviously. I mean, you have Caleb Williams there. You have a defensive head coach. It wouldn't have hurt to maybe. It wouldn't have
hurt to like the guy that he won the Heisman Trophy under, like that knows exactly what his strength. Like it could have probably helped, right? I don't know. Maybe, just maybe, they maybe wouldn't have fired Shane Waldron, the offensive coordinator, like halfway through the season. They may
We'll
have
never
not
know for
fired their
sure.
head coach, Matt Eberflus. They may have not had to promote Thomas Brown. It may not be a tire fire if maybe they gave Caleb Williams some consistency. So my short answer is, why not do the same? And the Giants hire offensive coordinator of the University of Miami, Shannon Dawson, to be the offensive coordinator. And keep in mind, this is his first year in Miami, but it's also Cam Ward's first year in Miami. If you were
Also, probably
thinking
Cam
about
Ward's
going,
last year in
yeah, it's
Miami as
probably
well, right? Yeah.
it's probably his
Yeah.
last year. So maybe it's Shannon's last year as well. Before that, he was the offensive coordinator at the University of Houston, where over his time they were 13th in total touchdowns on offense. Clearly, he's a very bright offensive mind. You know, he's not necessarily like an older guy. I think he's in his mid 40s at this point. But Adam, the Giants could do way worse than a tandem of Shannon Dawson with familiarity with someone like Cam Ward if the Giants drafted him. Jim Schwartz as the defensive coordinator, Mike Vrabel at the top, and John Robinson over there. Tell me how I did, Adam.
Yeah, I think there's something that's like right now you think about the Giants and Shane Bowen, ironically, another Tennessee Titan connection. But what you think about like a guy making a lateral move like that as opposed to a guy who rose up to head coaching ranks, maybe like Jim Schwartz, and then gets knocked back down a peg. I think there's something about getting better value in what you're doing. It's almost like when you think about Mike Kafka as the offensive coordinator. Well, he came over. What was he really? What was the role there in Kansas City? Clearly, do not hire any head coach from underneath Andy Reid because he's the guy that's doing everything. But when you look at that, you go, yeah, maybe I wanted a guy that had more experience. Same thing we mentioned Cliff Kingsbury. Hey, did it work as a head coach? Maybe not. Still great offensive mind. Let's get him back into where he functions best. Look what he's doing in Washington with a young quarterback, right? So all these things, again, you're creating a version of this that I think is pretty healthy and successful in terms of saying, I want guys that have already done it at a higher level, and then we're building back down. When it comes to the draft, about later how looks like Dion is doing everything he can to keep his son away from the New York Football Giants. I can't say I totally don't understand why he'd be doing that. So if you think about Cam Ward and you think about those connections, that's a natural progression of this. If you're going into next year's draft class and saying we're taking a quarterback, then we get into bigger, broader discussions if you're not going to go quarterback immediately. I don't hate it. I'm okay with it. One thing before we talk about if we would sign off on this and where we're going to slot it in. You know, when you do those things, sometimes they come up on TikTok and it says rank these movies as they pop up. We're going to have to slot in the Vrabel Robinson ticket here with Jim Schwartz, maybe with a head coach and QB tandem coming out of college. And we got to do a blind. We don't know what the next offer is going to be. So maybe we'll end up with a top 10 list here. One thing I will just come back to on the Robinson GM connection. So there's a couple of notable things here. One, he essentially was fired by all accounts, not just for this, but following the contract dispute with A.J. Brown, that was a big turning point for him being dismissed. And if you're the Giants, and if you really love Malik Neighbors, and you believe that he's a part of the future, gosh, you wish that your GM wasn't walking in the door being like, had a real hard time negotiating with a top talent wide receiver, watched him walk out the door and go somewhere else, ultimately having success for another roster, right? So that's one blemish. But even beyond that, and by the way, full transparency, we said this about Joe Shane, about every GM, you can look at these blemishes throughout the course of their history. But Robinson did miss. Kevin Dodd, high second-round pick in 2016, a bust. Isaiah Wilson didn't make it through half a dozen snaps in the league after being drafted late in the first round in 2020, along with red flags that he had away from football. And then you also had Caleb Farley, who has battled injuries, which was another pre-draft red flag. Like, these are things coming into it and has hardly played as well. So if you're thinking about high draft stock over the short term next couple of seasons, Robinson would give me some pause there. In the end, when we fast forward this to where would you rank this overall regime that Andy has created? Next time we come together, I'll steer the ship a little bit. And I'm thinking about knocking it out of the park on my first swing. So be tuned in for that. Vrabel, I like. I can understand everything about Vrabel. Staff, we can have a discussion about. Are you bullish on this? Do you like the idea of Robinson, Vrabel coming in the door? If we're making our top 10 list of GM coach candidates, where are you slotting this in, all things considered?
Well, that's a good question because there's also, if we're going to hire Mike Vrabel as the coach, that's kind of the foundation of this discussion
Yes,
here.
that's the
There is also an alternate general manager, Adam, that may make sense in this scenario.
They call that a late plot twist, boys and girls.
Ooh,
They call that a
interesting.
late plot twist.
So I agree with you that John Robinson had some challenges, and obviously the AJ Brown thing is not good. I mean, as you can see over the last couple of weeks in Philadelphia, maybe AJ Brown is just a little difficult to deal with. I don't know if you get that
Hey,
vibe either. But
breaking news.
yeah,
Almost every receiver is a
diva,
little bit difficult to deal with.
an excellent, amazing diva wide receiver. Who would have
Yeah.
thought that was ever going to be uttered? The other name that I was going to say is former assistant general manager, interim general manager of the Tennessee Titans, Ryan Cowden. So when John Robinson was let go for all of that, they hired Ryan Cowden as the interim general manager. Keep in mind that he was the director of player personnel in 16 and 17 and the VP of player personnel from 18 to 22. He helped construct that team that was successful, that was winning divisions, that was going
Right.
12-5. And once they decided to clean house, and he was kind of the interim for a handful of games after John Robinson left, Adam, he found a nice, cozy home.
Where'd he
And he
go?
found that home with the New York Football Giants. Ryan
Mm,
Cowden is currently an executive associate reporting directly into Joe Shane since 2023.
Is that a
So,
good thing?
well, I was going to pose this question to you afterwards. Like, you're like, ugh, no, someone in house? I thought we were just going to clean house here. But
Yeah.
if you're John Mara and you know
Yeah.
John Mara has like heartburn about hiring someone that he doesn't have familiarity with or something, at least you can say, we're turning the page over. We're giving it to someone with like Ryan Cowden, who did have some really good hits in terms of players in Tennessee. He's been in the building for over a year, so he understands what we're trying to do as an organization. So, and he also knows the deficiencies of this roster
Yep.
to be able to help it. And the cherry on top is he worked directly all those years with Mike Vrabel to figure out what type of players would work under Mike Vrabel's scheme. So for me, I think he's a sneaky one where he has familiarity with Vrabel and the Giants. And like maybe that's a little bit easier for everyone to stomach in this regard.
Yeah, it's interesting with that because I think so. The connection to Vrabel is interesting. And if I was going to go with one of the two, if you tell me Robinson or Cowden, I might say Cowden just because there's a little too much stink maybe attached to Robinson for my liking if I'm looking at the GM. But the other side of it would be, in spite of that connection, if you're going to go in-house, then I might look at it as, well, what about Brendan Brown? Like, if we're staying in-house, he seems to be a name that, again, when we start talking about, what assistant GMs are maybe in line for opportunities, he's going to be on the list. And this is what happens, by the way, around the NFL, around sports. Everyone's looking. It happens with players, too. You look over the other team and go, oh, they don't understand how valuable that guy is. Wait until we get him. Maybe like the Philadelphia Eagles with Saquon Barkley, right? Likewise with GMs and assistant GMs, you go, oh, they just don't realize what they're going to miss out on by not promoting Brendan Brown. Could I see a very nice scenario where Brendan Brown in-house is promoted to GM and Cowden is promoted to assistant GM, and now he continues to rebuild up his resume and also fosters that connection? Yes. The hard part for me is the clean house aspect of this, right? It's really hard to sell me on, we're going to blow this thing apart, but also we're going to keep some guys. And it's really because we've kept some special teams coordinators. We've kept some offensive, we've seen this happen with the Giants where, well, good guy understands, he's been in the building and we're loyal that way. And every time that happens, by and large, over the last handful of years, within a year or two, those guys are fired and someone else is brought in. And ironically, like in the case of Bobby Johnson, you watch them go off and be successful at their job somewhere else. So there's just some part of this that's like the Giants have been so dysfunctional, it's really hard to evaluate. So I wouldn't knock it, but my question back to that would be, is Mike Vrabel the caliber of head coaching candidate where you account for the fact that we have a guy in-house that has connections to him, right? Because you would be talking about a little bit reverse engineering here. We like Vrabel, and because we like Vrabel, now we're going to take Cowden and promote him to the GM position in our organization. That would be a significant leap. And obviously in that scenario, Brendan Brown isn't here. And then you would rebuild the organization. The front office side would be built out underneath Cowden's vision. I have a lot of concerns with that because then it's the scouting department. It's everything that goes along with that. And you're basically going to say, in a regime of failure under Joe Shane, Cowden was the one guy that had it all sorted out and just couldn't use his voice enough.
Yeah, listen, I fully agree with you. I specifically omitted Brendan Brown because I feel like there's probably
That's a whole
another
separate
path.
conversation here, I think.
Yeah, it
When we
feels like
talk,
there's
yes,
probably a
yes,
better situation and setup for him as the GM with a different head coach
yes,
to
yes.
really kind of shuffle the deck, even though he's been part of the situation, it seems like around the league, everyone really respects him and
He's
thinks
on the
that he is.
Titanic, but he didn't crash it into the iceberg, right? I mean,
Yeah, like he was the guy playing the violin as they were slowly going down. It's a little
all
bit
right.
different. So I think I would put him off to the side, and I think we'll get to a scenario where he is potentially the general
Yes,
manager with a
yes. Yeah,
different
yeah.
type of coach. Would I sign off on this? If this
Yes.
is
That's a
the
question.
if this is the first offer, it's not a bad offer because I do think that this at least would make the Giants relevant. Like I
Okay.
don't think under Mike Vrabel they would be a complete tire fire. I don't think what's happening this year happens under Mike Vrabel because he has too much cachet as a player and he's too strong of a personality in the locker room and he is ultra aggressive. Like I just don't see it getting to this level. Can we reach the heights that we want to go? Well, he clearly hasn't done that yet in terms of being able to make it past the AFC Championship game and make it to a Super Bowl. But the Giants could do a lot worse than Mike Vrabel with any of these setups. So, Adam, I will put this as like option number 3. In my grand scheme of things, I think
Option
this is
number
like
three.
a good third option for the Giants. I think there's
Okay.
probably going to be sneakily one or two more where you and I sit there and say, well, this one's a home run. Can the Giants actually make it happen? This
Yeah.
one seems to fit all of the things that the Giants need. And you know what? If all else fails, at least we can go this direction and at least get some stability within the organization.
Golly, if I'm putting it in the list, I like Vrabel. There's a lot to like about Mike Vrabel as a head coaching candidate, but overall in the package, whether it's Cowden or Robinson, that's one of the two tandems. I'm going to put this 5, which I think down the road I'll regret and say 4 would have been the right spot for him. But I'm going to put it at 5 because I already have, by the way, I have my home run hit. I already got that in my back pocket, ready to unleash whenever we need to. And then I have my second tier. I have at least 2 second tier options that I think would be on par, where we'd be debating
Yeah.
Vrabel and GM versus this coach, that coach. So I'll slot it in at 5. And one of the things I will just point out here, in terms of what Vrabel was with the Tennessee Titans and what we think he can bring to the Giants. And one guy that comes to mind is like Doug Peterson with Philadelphia. Then he goes to the Jaguars, a historically kind of bad, muddled franchise. And what happens? They're kind of still a bad, muddled franchise, right? So is Vrabel the guy that can turn that around? The Tennessee Titans, like when you go back, they had a couple of lean years in 04, 05, successful prior to that. We know Air McNair years and all those things, right? But after that, like when you run through this 8-8, 10-6, 13-3, 8-8, 6-10, 9-7, 6-10, 7-9, they bottom out there for 2 more years again in 14-15 before the new regime comes in. But my point here is like, if you go back, I've only got 6 losing seasons going back to 2005. They just organizationally have been a pretty stable place, regardless of coaches, regardless of GMs. So in that way, I'm a little chicken or the egg on this. Is it that Mike Vrabel and the GM helped bring more stability back to the organization? Or is it that it's just been a well-run organization overall and you're slotting in and you're set with a good starting off point? And if it's a good starting off point versus where the Giants are right now, I'd probably still have some of the same, concerns or curiosities. But all that to say, I do like Vrabel as a head coaching candidate. I just do not think that in the end, I'll hold him up maybe in my top 2 or even top 3 when I'm thinking about what I want the Giants to do going into next season, excuse me.
Yeah. At the end of the day, I
Yes,
think
sir.
you and I both can agree that while a defensive minded head coach is a possibility and an
Sure.
option, the way that this league is moving with offenses and a head coach that will be around for a while, especially if the Giants are going to be drafting a quarterback of the future, seems to be a more likely journey that the Giants are willing to go on. And so, yes, I am in complete agreement with you on that front. I'm just like, man, we've been pretty terrible the last 2 years. Wouldn't it be nice to like
Of
our
course.
biggest qualm would be like, oh man, we can't beat the Detroit Lions in the NFC title game. Like imagine how far we would have to go from where we are today. And I think at least a defensive minded coach like Mike Vrabel gets us closer to that than where we are currently constructed.
Who knows? Maybe Shane Bowen remains the defensive coordinator if they hire
I
Mike Vrabel
thought
as the
about
head coach. Andy would have a whole new set of issues to bring up when
that.
it comes to this possibility. But at the end of the day, as Andy says, this is what I think you need to be doing right now. Maybe it comes to pass the Giants don't make any decision and they just run it back next year. We both are kind of in the camp of that just feels like the wrong decision at this time. So let's talk about all these possibilities because I guarantee you, 4 out of the top 5 options we discuss are going to be other places next season. You're going to see organizations making these type of moves, and we'll have a very clear comparison, something that we'll do reflecting back over the last 3 seasons of the Joe Shane Brian Dable ticket as well. And so, my friends, until we come back in on Friday and talk about the matchup over the weekend, you get us over on YouTube. You get us over on your podcast feeds as well at One Giant Podcast. Subscribe, share with your friends around this holiday season. It's the season of giving. And also at Adam Warmbrecht, at AMAC214, and at One Giant Podcast over on X. Until next time, until the best times. As Andrew Makowitz would want, need, and demand that people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.